Only 9 people were in that room. 9 people. And not one of them, not the doorman, not the instructor standing against the wall, not the 3 men sitting ringside, not a single one of them could fully describe what happened next. They tried. Years later, they would sit across from journalists, from students, from old friends over cold drinks, and they would open their mouths and they would search for the words, and the words would fail them every time. Because there are things the human eye can register, but the human mind cannot fully process. What happened that night in a private training hall in Los Angeles in the spring of 1967 was one of those things. This is the story they never told on camera. This is the story the footage never captured, because there was no footage. This is the night a 165-pound man from Hong Kong walked into a room full of skeptics and left as something else entirely. Something that didn't have a clean word in English. Something closer to a force of nature than a person. Rewind. The city was loud that year. The Sunset Strip was alive with noise, with protest, with music bleeding out of club doors at 2 a.m. Muhammad Ali had just been stripped of his title. The world was arguing about power, who had it, who deserved it, what it really looked like when it stood in front of you. In the martial arts world, those arguments were even louder. Karate dojos were multiplying across California. Japanese masters were establishing schools with strict hierarchies, formal rankings, ironclad traditions. Korean stylists were building followings. The boxing world and the wrestling world and the nascent world of American martial arts were all pressing against each other, all competing for the same thing, legitimacy. And in the middle of all of that, there was a young Chinese-American actor and martial arts instructor named Bruce Lee, who was doing something that made every single one of them deeply, personally uncomfortable. He was saying they were wrong. Not quietly, not diplomatically. He was saying it in demonstrations, in seminars, in private conversations that somehow always ended up being repeated across the entire community within 48 hours. He was saying that style was limitation, that rigid tradition was a cage, that the man who trained in only one system was a man who had chosen to be incomplete. You can imagine how that landed.
His name was Victor Ford. He was not famous. He was never going to be famous. But in the private, insular world of West Coast martial arts in the late 1960s, he was something, and he knew it. 6 feet 2 inches tall, 220 pounds, most of it built through 10 years of dedicated weight training layered on top of a natural frame that had made him the largest kid in every room since junior high school. He had trained in Shotokan karate for 7 years under 2 different Japanese instructors, both of whom had certified him as an advanced student, a man of serious rank and serious skill. He moved well for his size. He was fast, not blisteringly fast, but fast enough that smaller opponents had consistently underestimated him, assumed his size meant sluggishness, and paid for that assumption with the floor. He had heard Bruce Lee speak at a demonstration 3 weeks earlier, and something about it had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the techniques Lee had demonstrated. Those were impressive, unusual, fluid, hard to categorize. It wasn't the philosophy Lee had outlined, though that had irritated him too, the casual dismissal of everything Ford had dedicated a decade of his life to mastering. It was the confidence. It was the way Bruce Lee stood in front of a room full of martial artists, men who had trained their entire adult lives, men with credentials and lineages and calloused knuckles, and spoke to them with the quiet, absolute certainty of a man who had already run every calculation and already knew the answer. That kind of confidence, in Ford's experience, usually came from size. It usually came from having stood in front of enough opponents and been large enough and strong enough that the question of who would win had never really been in serious doubt. Bruce Lee was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighed, by Ford's estimation, maybe 160 pounds on a heavy day. And yet there he stood, certain as stone. It bothered Ford in a place he didn't want to admit existed. He made some calls. He had a mutual connection, a man named Harris who ran a small training hall in the valley and knew people on both sides of the various martial arts factions dividing the Los Angeles community. Harris could arrange things, informal things, private things, a meeting, a conversation, a demonstration perhaps. Ford told Harris what he wanted. Harris made some calls, and 3 days later, a Thursday evening in late spring, 9 people gathered in Harris's training hall, and 2 of them stood across from each other on a wooden floor that had seen 1,000 hours of training, but nothing quite like what it was about to witness. Bruce Lee arrived with Dan Inosanto. That alone told you something. Inosanto was not decoration. He was not there to carry bags. He was a martial artist of extraordinary ability in his own right, a man who understood what Bruce Lee was building, this evolving, adapting system that Lee had begun calling Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, and who trained with a ferocity and intelligence that matched his teacher's own. They walked in together. Lee was wearing dark slacks and a simple black shirt. No gi, no uniform, no performance of tradition. He looked around the room once, took it in, nodded slightly to Harris, and said nothing. Ford was already there, standing near the far wall with 2 of his students. He had dressed for this, clean white gi top, black belts sitting precisely at his waist. He was surrounded by the visible language of his training, the accumulated symbols of 10 years of work. He looked at Bruce Lee and felt the first flicker of something he would never fully admit to feeling. He pushed it down. A couple of other men were in the room, instructors and senior students from the local martial arts community who had been invited by Harris as witnesses, men who would remember, men who would talk. That was intentional on both sides. No one shook hands at first. Harris made brief introductions, more for the room than for the 2 men at the center of it, and then Ford spoke.
He didn't yell it. That would have been too obvious. He said it the way a man says something he believes is simply a fact, a casual observation, the kind of thing you'd say about the weather or the traffic on the 101. He looked at Bruce Lee, really looked at him, let his gaze travel from Lee's shoes up to his face in a way that was slow and deliberate and designed to communicate a very specific message. And he said, "I expected someone bigger." The room shifted. Not loudly, subtly. The way a room shifts when someone has just said the thing everyone knew someone was going to say, and the saying of it makes it real. One of Ford's students exhaled, something between a breath and a laugh. Bruce Lee did not change expression. That was the thing the witnesses remembered most consistently when they told this story years later. Not what Ford said, not what happened afterward. The thing they remembered was what Bruce Lee's face did in the 2 seconds after Ford made that remark. It did nothing. Not controlled nothing, not suppressed anger being held behind a mask. Genuine nothing. The comment had arrived in the room, had landed somewhere near Bruce Lee, and had affected him the way a stone affects deep water. A brief disturbance on the surface, instantly gone. He looked at Ford with calm, clear eyes. And then he smiled. Not a warm smile, not a performer's smile, something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things. He said, "Show me what you have." What happened next lasted approximately 4 minutes before the actual confrontation, but those who were there described those 4 minutes as feeling much longer. Ford began to move, not attacking, circling, establishing distance, reading. This was his process, methodical, patient, systematic. He had used it against dozens of opponents in his training years. He would move, observe, measure the response, map the patterns, find the opening. He was very good at it. Bruce Lee watched him, stood mostly still in the center of that wooden floor, and watched Ford move around him the way you'd watch weather approaching from a distance. Not alarmed, not even particularly concerned, just aware. One of the men standing ringside would later say that it reminded him of a nature documentary he'd seen, a large predator circling something that was very still and very calm, and the unsettling suspicion that maybe the stillness wasn't fear. Ford threw a testing strike, fast, controlled, aimed at Bruce Lee's shoulder, a probe, not a commitment. Lee moved. That was when the room began to change temperature, because Lee's movement, even just that small non-committal slip away from the probe, was something the men in that room had never quite seen before in exactly that combination. It wasn't a block, it wasn't a dodge, it was something in between those things and somehow more efficient than either of them, a redirection of the force of the attack before the attack had properly arrived, using almost no energy, creating almost no noise. Ford felt it, or rather felt the absence of it. His strike connected with nothing, with air, and his momentum carried him 1/2 step further than he'd intended. It was a tiny thing, but it got his attention. He reset, reassessed. His students were watching from the wall. One of them had his arms crossed. He slowly uncrossed them.
The second exchange was faster. Ford committed more. 2 strikes in combination, sharp, practiced, the kind of clean karate technique that had served him for a decade, the kind of combination that had put men on the floor before. The first one found nothing. Lee had moved. The second one, Ford would think about this for years afterward. The second one he never actually finished, because something happened between the initiation of that second strike and its intended completion. Something interfered. He didn't see it, not completely. His eyes were trained, his reflexes were real, his experience was genuine, and he still didn't see it. A pressure on his forward wrist, a shift in his balance, just slight, just a few degrees, but enough. And then a sensation in the center line of his body, not painful, not yet, but firm, a kind of immovable presence. He was stopped. Not thrown, not struck. Stopped. Bruce Lee's hand was flat against Ford's chest, and Bruce Lee was looking at him with those calm, clear eyes from a distance of about 14 inches, and he said quietly, so quietly that only the two of them heard it, "That's where it ends." The room was completely still. Nobody breathed. This was the moment. Everyone in that room understood they were standing at the edge of something. Ford stepped back. His jaw tightened. Something moved across his face that he fought down quickly. What followed happened in, and the witnesses were consistent about this number, which is remarkable given what they were watching, approximately 3 seconds, possibly less. Ford attacked with everything this time. No more measuring, no more patience. The full vocabulary of 10 years, committed, real, the kind of explosive combination attack that he had trained his body to produce at maximum speed and maximum force. The first strike, a right mid-level punch. Lee's body was no longer where the punch was aimed. He had moved before the commitment was visible, before the muscle engagement had even fully registered to Ford's own proprioception. Ford felt the air change. Then something hit him. Not a punch, not exactly. Something, a strike, a deflection, a disruption, that connected with his right shoulder and redirected his entire forward momentum sideways in a way that felt like colliding with a wall that wasn't there a moment ago. He stumbled. 1 step, 2, turned back. Bruce Lee was standing exactly where he'd been standing before any of this happened. Hadn't moved more than 18 inches total across the entire 3-second exchange. His breathing was unchanged. His expression was unchanged. He was looking at Ford with the same quiet clarity he'd carried since the moment he walked in the door. Ford stood there for a long moment. His shoulder was singing with a deep, radiating ache that he could already tell was going to be significant. Not broken, but something in the joint had been compressed or shifted or disrupted in a way that would make itself known for weeks. From a man who, by every external measurement, should not have been able to generate that kind of force from that kind of distance in that amount of time. His students were silent. The men along the wall were silent. Even Harris, who had seen considerable things in 30 years of martial arts, was silent. Ford looked at Bruce Lee, and Bruce Lee looked back, and neither of them said anything for a long time.
Nobody spoke first. That was the thing about a room like that. 9 men, all of them trained, all of them schooled in the discipline of holding themselves together under pressure, and none of them could find a word that fit what they had just watched.
Language kept arriving and kept being insufficient and kept being set aside. The silence lasted longer than silences usually last in rooms full of people. Victor Forde was standing 8 feet back from where he'd been standing when he launched his combination. His shoulder was telling him something he wasn't ready to fully hear yet. His students were against the wall, and he could feel them without looking at them, could feel the specific quality of their stillness, which was different from the stillness they'd arrived with, different in a way he understood and didn't want to examine too closely right now. Bruce Lee hadn't moved. That was the part that kept asserting itself, kept demanding to be acknowledged. In the entire exchange, the circling, the probes, the combination, the stop, Bruce Lee had moved perhaps 18 inches in total. He had spent the rest of the time standing exactly where he stood now, in the middle of Harris's training hall floor, looking at Forde with those quiet, complete eyes. His breathing was unchanged. That detail was somehow the most disturbing of all. When Forde finally spoke, his voice had lost the particular quality it carried when he said, "I expected someone bigger." That voice, the casual, weight of the world certainty of it, was simply gone. What replaced it was something more honest, a stripped-down sound, the voice of a man talking to another man without the architecture of ego holding it up. He said, "How?" Not a full question, just the one word, standing alone. Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. Then he did something that the witnesses would describe differently depending on who was telling the story. Some said he smiled, some said he didn't, some said he tilted his head slightly. One man insisted he exhaled once, slowly, before he spoke. What they all agreed on was what he said. "You were watching my hands." Forde said nothing. "Everyone watches the hands," Lee continued, his voice the same quiet register it had maintained all evening. "The hands are the last thing that matters." He was not lecturing. That was important. He was not performing wisdom for the room. He was talking to Forde directly, specifically, the way a man talks to another man when he has genuine respect for the question being asked. "By the time you see the hands," he said, "the decision is already 3 moves behind you." Something shifted in the training hall when Lee spoke. The witnesses, who had been holding themselves in varying states of suspended disbelief since the exchange, began to breathe at normal intervals again. 2 men against the left wall exchanged a look. Harris, standing near the center, uncrossed his arms. One of Forde's students, the younger one, who'd made that half-exhale sound at the beginning of the evening, sat down slowly on the bench near the wall. Not dramatically, just the way a person sits down when their legs decide they've been asked to hold up too much for too long. Victor took 2 steps forward, not aggressive, deliberate. He looked at Bruce Lee differently now, not the measuring look from before, not the slow appraisal from feet to face that was designed to communicate hierarchy. This was something else. This was looking. "Again," he said. It wasn't the same word it had been 30 minutes earlier when he'd said it as a command, a reassertion of his own terms. This time it was a request. Bruce Lee looked at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head, slowly, once. "You've already seen it," he said. "Seeing it twice doesn't teach you anything new."
What happened in the next 40 minutes was not what anyone in that room had come to see. They had come for confrontation, for the satisfaction of a clear outcome. Either the big man put the small man on the floor and the point was made, or the small man did something remarkable and was talked about in dojos for a year. What they got was a conversation. Bruce Lee sat down on the edge of the training area, not in a chair, on the floor, cross-legged, entirely at ease, and he talked. Not a monologue, not a lecture. He responded to the specific questions that began to come from the men in the room, carefully at first, then with more momentum as the room's temperature finished its change from confrontation to something else entirely. He talked about the fundamental dishonesty of style, about the way a system, any system, becomes a prison if you stop questioning it, about how the first casualty of a rigid tradition is always the practitioner's own ability to see clearly. "If I tell you to punch like this," he said, demonstrating briefly from his seated position, a motion of startling speed even while cross-legged, and you spend 10 years learning to punch like this, then you have learned one thing,
and you have forgotten 10,000 things, and the man in front of you has not agreed to conform to the one thing you learned. Someone in the room, one of the older instructors, said, "But tradition exists for a reason." Lee looked at him, nodded seriously. "Yes, the reason is that it worked once in a specific situation for a specific body against a specific opponent in a specific moment in history." He paused. "Is that situation your situation?" Nobody answered. "Water," he said, after a moment, "doesn't insist on being ice." Ford didn't say much during the conversation. He sat against the wall, the same wall where his students were, and he listened. His right shoulder was running a low, persistent signal that he was beginning to fully acknowledge. He moved it once, carefully, testing the range, and the range was there, but the edges of it were sharp. He had been hit in training before, many times. He had given and received in equal measure across 10 years of honest practice. But this was different, and he knew it was different, and the knowing of it was sitting in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed. It wasn't the technique. He could analyze the technique, the redirect, the use of his own momentum, the way Lee had neutralized his size advantage by refusing to oppose it directly. These were not mysteries. He had heard of these principles. He could see them looking back. The thing that was sitting in his chest was something else. It was the time. He had launched his combination, had full commitment, everything, all of it, the full vocabulary of 10 years, and what had countered it had arrived before he could see it coming, not barely before, well before, as if the response had been decided at the same moment he decided to strike, or perhaps slightly before. That was the stone in his chest. Not that he had lost an exchange, not even that he had been made to look slow, him, a man who had never been slow. It was that someone had read his intention before his intention had fully become action. It was that his own body was more transparent to another person than it had ever been to himself. He and Inosanto stood, exchanged brief, genuine words with Harris, nothing ceremonial, the kind of short and specific conversation that happens between people who have a real relationship rather than a professional one.
Bruce Lee would go on from that spring evening in 1967 to demonstrate the principles of Jeet Kune Do to audiences and students across 2 countries. He would make films that would reach hundreds of millions of people. He would become something that transcended the category of person and entered the category of idea. But that happened later. On that Thursday night in the San Fernando Valley, in a plain building with a steel door and a wooden dummy in the corner, he was simply a 28-year-old man in a black shirt who walked into a room full of people who thought size was power. And he showed them, without drama, without announcement, without a single unnecessary motion, what power actually was. It was not the 220 pounds. It was not the 10 years of ranked karate. It was not the height, the reach, the accumulated mass of a body built for dominance. Power was the ability to be completely present in the moment before the moment arrived. Power was the inch. Power was reading the intention behind the action behind the intention, and having already moved before the moving was visible. Power was standing still at the center of a room and not needing the room to confirm anything about you. This was the thing Bruce Lee understood at an age when most people are still arguing with themselves about what they believe. This was the thing he carried into every room he ever entered. Not a technique, not a style, not a system. A way of being so completely and honestly himself that there was simply no space for anything else to land.